The first video that I did was on climate change. I actually had a full presentation that I wanted to give and got distracted by a statistical question related to one of the points that I wanted to make. I have decided to break that down into a few other videos just because it's easier, people have short attention spans, etc. But with Trump being elected, the environmentalists are whining, and they're whining about climate change because his opinion is not that we have, a world-ending catastrophe that we need to throw money at like Obama's. So I guess the real question is, what is the current state of the climate change debate? Let's take a look.
Well, you got different conversations. You have, do you accept the science of man's impact on the warming of the planet? And then you have, well, what policy considerations do you make in light of that science? That's one discussion.
Wow, that looks really cool. Like, they're going to have a discussion on the uncertainties and technical limitations of the field, as well as a well-informed risk assessment. This is going to be great.
The current president believes that the human beings are affecting the climate. There are scientists that believe that that's not happening. I think that,
the
for me
overwhelming
personally,
consensus in the scientific community is that man's actions have an impact on science. So you have to correct that whenever it comes out.
Nope. We're going to get two idiots having a passionate argument about how many other people agree with them on a subject they know nothing about. Fantastic. Because science is like voting. And just like voting, the popular vote doesn't matter. You actually have to convince people outside of your small, specialized field that you're technically correct and not just talking out of your ass. In fact, arguing consensus looks a lot like this.
Right to work is wrong for workers and wrong for America. Now, having said all this, why aren't I 50 points ahead, you might ask?
The reason arguments from authority, consensus, or simply asserting you're correct doesn't work is by not explicitly addressing, acknowledging, or dealing with criticism of your hypothesis. You're implicitly saying that you cannot deal with criticism of your hypothesis. Consensus arguments do nothing more than bolster those who already agree with you. It doesn't address the concerns of those who disagree with you, and it does nothing to sway those who are neutral on the subject. It also tends to look constructed and fake, as if you're attempting to force an issue rather than explaining it. A great example is the consensus papers produced in climate change. If you have to couch your statements, such as among abstracts expressing a position, so that you can reject 66.4% or 2/3 of your data, and you find out that really only 62.7% of the actual papers in general for their scientists express a position endorsing AGW, it really strains the credulity and credibility of the people making a claim about consensus. All of these problems come before we actually define what the consensus on climate change actually is. If you want to make a generic statement that human beings have some effect on the climate, I'll agree with you. If you want to say that human beings are responsible for most of it, or greater than 50%, I'm going to join the majority of scientists in saying, well, you can't say that. In fact, of the 12,000 papers Cook studied, only about 37 were willing to put a number to it. That means that 99.7% of scientists are unwilling to quantify how much of an effect human beings have had on the climate. But more strange is the inability of climate scientists to convey and convince fields that are outside of climate science. In fact, skepticism increases with knowledge of science and climate science. Only about 36% of engineers are willing to endorse the idea that human beings are majorly responsible and that we can do something about it or should do something about it, the idea that climate change is harmful. And while you could say, well, you should listen to the experts, I would no sooner listen to an expert on climate science as an authority figure on climate science than I would a homeopath on the efficacy of homeopathy. I wouldn't listen to a paranormal researcher tell me how effective and accurate paranormal research is. They are, by definition, studying something that they believe is real, that is significant. And climate scientists are no different. You wouldn't be studying climate change if it didn't change. You wouldn't be studying climate change if you believed that there was no way to affect or influence it. If it was completely outside of the control of everything. You might study it a little bit to try to understand where it's going, but you certainly wouldn't study it if you didn't feel that there was some form of climate change. To assert that we should listen to climate scientists when they present the data and nobody actually jumps on board with the consensus is fundamentally misleading. I don't want to deal with a consensus argument. I really don't. I actually despise it. I feel that every time I have to argue with somebody who starts out that way, I am legitimately arguing with a retarded person. They don't have an argument, they don't have a valid point, but they're going to make one anyways. The problem is that's what everybody does. And the last time I argued the consensus argument was about 10 years ago. My dad responded by dropping a notebook with charts and tables and graphs and papers that overwhelmed me, and I ended up changing my opinion and working a more accurate and well-informed approach. But this is always the starting point for this debate. It is always the politician's go-to argument that there's a scientific consensus. Well, there may be a scientific consensus that human beings have some effect, but that is politically irrelevant. We can't start basing major social changes on the idea that people believe that something might happen, right? It doesn't work that way. So, this is the first video that I have to do dealing with the consensus. If I don't do this, then all the rest of my videos will have to be overcoming the consensus argument. For the future videos, I'm going to actually deal with the specific reasons as to why I'm skeptical of the ability of us to influence the climate in a significant way.